On March 27, 2004, in a quiet apartment complex in Sherman, Texas, three innocent people lost their lives in one of the most brutal crimes the city had ever seen. But this isn't just a story about what happened on that terrible morning. This is a story about warnings that went unheeded, about cries for help that fell on deaf ears, about a mental health system, a justice system, and a society that looked away at every critical moment when intervention might have changed everything. This is the story of Andre Lee Thomas, a case so disturbing, so preventable, that it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about mental illness, poverty, racism, and who we choose to save. Before we begin, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear involves graphic violence, mental illness, and deeply troubling content. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. March 17, 1983, Muskogee County, Oklahoma. Andre Lee Thomas entered a world that mental health experts would later describe with chilling precision as a pedigree predictive of disaster. Those aren't my words. That's from the forensic psychiatrist who examined his case. A pedigree predictive of catastrophe. Andre was the fifth of six boys, raised primarily by his mother, Rochelle, in Sherman, Texas. But to understand his story, we need to go back further to the generations of trauma and mental illness that preceded him. His maternal grandmother, Vivian, began drinking by her mid-teens. She was 14 years old when she had her first child. Eventually, she would have 9 children with 5 different men. Her second husband, Walter Martin, was violently abusive. In 1973, he did the unthinkable. He shot and killed Rochelle's 17-year-old brother, Gregory, while she watched. Imagine being a young woman, watching your stepfather murder your teenage brother. Rochelle never recovered from that trauma. She turned to alcohol to numb the pain, fell into deep depression, and reportedly suffered abuse at the hands of her own stepfather. She also developed a belief that she received divine messages through dreams and visions, a supposed spiritual gift she claimed would pass to her son Andre. Andre's father, Danny, came from virtually identical circumstances. Generational alcoholism. Violence threaded through every family gathering. Mental illness is woven into the family tree. One of Danny's brothers suffered from alcohol-induced dementia. Another was institutionalized in a psychiatric facility. Andre himself would eventually be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. So would 2 of his brothers. Think about that for a moment. Out of 6 boys in that family, 3 were diagnosed with schizophrenia. The genetic and environmental factors were overwhelming. The warning signs weren't just present, they were screaming. The question that haunts this case is simple. Why did no one listen? Please like this video, share it, comment, and subscribe for more stories. Here's what makes this story even more heartbreaking. Andre Thomas showed extraordinary promise early on. At his Baptist church in Sherman, his Sunday school teacher remembered him as exceptionally smart and respectful, the kind of kid who would answer questions before she even finished asking them. She described him as eager to learn, always engaged, always participating. He was placed in gifted and talented programs at school. His kindergarten and first grade report cards were outstanding. His second grade teacher called him a strong and delightful student with real potential. But Rochelle's instability was already tearing apart any chance at consistency or stability. During second grade alone, Andre attended 3 different schools in 3 different cities across 2 different states. Later, when asked about her son's education during legal proceedings, Rochelle admitted she couldn't even remember where he went to school. "I simply couldn't keep track of them," she testified. Too many children. Too much chaos. Too much trauma. The family lived in crushing poverty, often without running water, heat, or electricity. They depended on local churches and charitable donations just to keep the lights on. Sometimes even that wasn't enough. Around age 9 or 10, something fundamental shifted in Andre's mind. He began hearing voices of angels and demons, he said, arguing inside his head. Constant warfare in his skull between good and evil. By third grade, he was telling classmates in complete seriousness that he was riding from the video game Mortal Kombat. Not pretending. Not playing. He genuinely believed it. At home, the psychological abuse intensified. His mother, struggling with her own demons and mental health, would tell Andre during their worst moments that she should have aborted him, that he should never have been born. Twice before age 13, Andre attempted to take his own life. One attempt involved a butcher knife. Both times were triggered by his mother telling him she wished he'd never been born. Think about that for a moment. A child, already hearing voices, already struggling with reality, being told by his own mother that he should never have existed. And yet, despite all of this, nobody intervened. No social services. No mental health intervention. No one stepped in to break the cycle. At age 11, Andre started getting into trouble with the law. Minor offenses such as damaging golf carts at a local course and petty theft. Then, at 13, he stole a car and drove it into a ditch. When he met with his probation officer at age 12 for the first time, no parent or guardian showed up to support him. Rochelle routinely missed appointments. Once, when the probation officer called to ask why Andre hadn't shown up for a meeting, she told him it was simply too cold for her son to be outside. The justice system, dysfunctional as it was, became Andre's de facto parent, the only institution keeping track of him, the only structure in his chaotic life. At 14 years old, Andre went before a judge and asked for a work permit so he could pay off his restitution and court fees. He wanted to work. He wanted to be responsible. The judge told him he was too young to work. So Andre did what countless troubled kids with untreated mental illness do. He self-medicated. Alcohol and marijuana became his way of trying to quiet the voices in his head. It didn't work, of course. It never does. But what else could he do? He had no access to real mental health care. His family couldn't afford it. The system wasn't offering it. At 15, during a brief stay in juvenile detention, Andre developed increasingly troubling thoughts and was placed on suicide watch. The facility recognized he was in crisis. But when he was released, no follow-up mental health services, no counseling, no medication, nothing. He was just sent back into the same environment that had created the crisis in the first place. At 16 years old, Andre's longtime girlfriend, Boren, became pregnant with their son, Andre Jr. Andre dropped out of school in 9th grade, earned his GED, and started working a series of low-wage jobs to support his new family. One of those jobs was digging graves at Sherman's West Hill Cemetery. Imagine being 16, a father, mentally ill, and digging graves to make ends meet. On his 18th birthday in March 2001, Andre and Laura married. She was 17. They moved in with Andre's mother, hoping for a fresh start. Rochelle kicked them out 2 weeks later. With nowhere to go together, Laura and baby Andre Jr. moved in with her parents. Andre moved in with one of his brothers. They tried to make the marriage work, but after just 4.5 months, they separated permanently. Laura eventually moved in with a new boyfriend. In February 2003, she gave birth to a daughter, Leyha. Following the separation, Andre's grip on reality began to slip entirely. He lost his seasonal lawn mowing work, couldn't pay for heat or electricity in his apartment. Because his residence lacked basic utilities, Laura started limiting his visits with their son. She had valid concerns that the place wasn't safe for a child. Andre told his father he felt trapped in a circle he couldn't break out of. He was spiraling, and he knew it. He became obsessed with the Book of Revelation's apocalyptic imagery, consuming his thoughts. He studied the dollar bill obsessively, convinced its symbols contained some kind of code for his salvation. The eye atop the pyramid. The Latin phrase annuit coeptus. He approves of our undertakings. The number 13 is repeated throughout the design. In his fractured, schizophrenic mind, a terrible narrative began to take shape. His estranged wife, Laura, was Jezebel, the wicked biblical queen. His 4-year-old son, Andre Jr., was the Antichrist. Laura's 13-month-old daughter, Leyha, was possessed by evil spirits. These weren't fleeting thoughts. These were absolute convictions in his mind. His psychosis had become so severe that he couldn't distinguish between reality and delusion. His behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He would cover his mouth with duct tape and refuse to speak to his family for days at a time. He talked about experiencing déjà vu constantly, life repeating itself over and over, event happening again and again in an endless loop. In February 2004, just weeks before the murders, Andre overdosed on cough medicine and was taken to a mental health facility in Sherman. He was in a clear crisis. He begged the staff to kill him. "Life is too much for me to handle," he pleaded. Somehow, and this is crucial, the staff let him leave after he simply promised he was going straight to a nearby hospital for treatment. He never showed up. A warrant was issued for his immediate apprehension. Police never enforced it. They never went looking for him. A few weeks later, Andre overdosed again, this time stabbing himself with a knife in an apparent suicide attempt. He walked into the emergency room at Texoma Medical Center in Denison, covered in blood, clearly in the midst of a psychotic break. The attending physician recognized the severity immediately. This wasn't someone having a bad day. This was a deeply psychotic individual in urgent need of psychiatric care. This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill crazy person, the doctor later testified. Thomas is psychotic. He thinks something like the holodeck on Star Trek is happening to him. Andre told the doctor he was trying to cross over into heaven. The physician filled out an emergency detention order to hold him against his will and referred him to the hospital's psychiatric unit. While staffers waited for a judge to sign the paperwork, a process that should have taken maybe an hour, Andre simply walked out of the emergency room. The hospital called the police to report that a dangerously psychotic individual had just left against medical advice. There's no evidence that officers went to his mother's house. No evidence that they checked any of his relatives' homes. No evidence that they did anything at all. Less than 24 hours later, Andre Thomas would commit an act so horrific that it would shock even seasoned homicide investigators. Saturday morning, March 27, 2004. Sherman, Texas. Laura Boren, now 20 years old, was home alone with her 2 young children in a third-floor apartment. 4-year-old Andre, Jr., and 13-month-old Leyha. Laura's boyfriend was at work. It was just the 3 of them. Their apartment overlooked Fairview Park, where bright slides and swings created a cheerful scene for the neighborhood kids, a stark contrast to the unimaginable horror about to unfold inside. Andre Thomas climbed the stairs carrying 3 knives in his pocket and a roll of duct tape. He'd spent the previous night in a state of absolute psychotic conviction. He believed with every fiber of his being that God had given him a direct command. Kill Laura. Kill Andre, Jr., kill Leyha. Remove their hearts to free them from the demons he was certain inhabited their bodies. He deliberately chosen 3 separate knives because, in his delusion, he believed God didn't want him to cross-contaminate their blood. If their blood mixed, he thought, the demons inside each of them would somehow survive the ritual. Andre kicked down the apartment door and attacked Laura in the living room, stabbing her repeatedly. After she died, he crudely attempted to cut open her chest to remove her heart. In his frenzy, he extracted part of her lung instead, believing it was her heart. He moved down the hallway past stuffed animals, baby dolls, and plastic toys scattered across the floor to the bedroom the children shared. He killed 13-month-old Leyha. Then 4-year-old Andre Jr., his own son, lay in his small bed. The medical examiner would later determine that he attempted to remove the children's hearts as well. Each victim suffered the same brutal treatment. Before leaving the blood-soaked apartment, Andre did something that reveals just how deep his delusion ran. He positioned a folded dollar bill next to Laura's body, the eye of the pyramid facing upward. In his fractured mind, this was a religious statement, proof that God approved of what he'd done, confirmation of his role in some cosmic battle between good and evil. Then Andre attempted to end his own life with 3 stab wounds to his chest. When he realized he wasn't dying as quickly as he hoped, he left. Andre walked 5 miles to his father's house, still carrying the organs he'd removed in his pockets, bleeding from his self-inflicted chest wounds, but somehow still ambulatory. At his father's residence, he took the organs, which he believed were hearts but were actually pieces of lungs, placed them in a plastic bag, and threw them in the trash. At some point during those hours, Andre called Laura's parents and left a voicemail message that still haunts anyone who's heard it. His voice shaking, clearly distressed, he said, "Sherry, this is Andre. I need y'all's help. Something bad is happening to me, and it keeps happening, and I don't know what's going on. I need some help. I think I'm in hell. I need help. Somebody needs to come and help me. I need help. I'm desperate. I'm afraid to go to sleep." Listen to those words again. Something bad is happening to me, and it keeps happening. Even after committing these horrific murders, Andre didn't fully understand what he'd done. He knew something was terribly wrong. He knew he needed help. But his psychosis was so severe that he couldn't grasp reality. Shortly after leaving that message, Andre walked into the Sherman Police Department, still bleeding from his chest wounds. He approached the dispatcher and said calmly, "I just murdered 3 people and stabbed myself in the chest." His very first question to the police: "Will I be forgiven?" Please like this video, share it, comment, and subscribe for more stories. He explained to officers that God had instructed him to commit the killings. All three victims were demons, he said, with complete certainty. "I thought I was doing the will of God." In the ambulance on the way to the hospital for emergency surgery, Andre told the EMT, "I just don't understand. I just wanted to die to pay for my sins." 5 days after his arrest, April 1st, 2004, Andre sat in his glass-walled observation cell at Grayson County Jail. He was reading his Bible when he came to Matthew 5 verse 29. "If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. You should lose one part of your body rather than have your whole body thrown into hell." With his bare hands, Andre gouged out his right eye. The guards found him with the eye sitting in his hand. The injury was severe enough to permanently blind him in that eye. He was declared incompetent for trial and transferred to the secure wing of North Texas State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation and treatment. There, he continued hearing voices, talking to himself, experiencing recurring nightmares about scorpions and tarantulas trying to eat him alive. After 47 days of evaluations and medications, state psychiatrist Joseph Black wrote to the court that Andre had substance-induced psychosis, essentially arguing that his mental illness was caused or exacerbated by his marijuana and alcohol use. Black stated Andre was competent to stand trial and suggested he might be exaggerating his mental illness through aberrant behavior to avoid punishment. Looking back, Andre's defense attorney R.J. Haygood, who was himself battling pancreatitis during the trial, would later say he deeply regretted not objecting to Dr. Black's assessment and not requesting additional competency hearings. Andre's trial began on February 15, 2005, less than a year after the murders. He was tried only for the death of 13-month-old Leyha Hughes, as killing a child under 6 carries an automatic death sentence in Texas. The trial took place in Sherman, Texas, a town with a dark and ugly history that would cast a long shadow over the proceedings. In 1930, a black farm worker named George Hughes was accused of assaulting a white woman. Before he could stand trial, a mob of up to 5,000 people descended on the Grayson County Courthouse. They battled state police, set the building on fire, and lynched Hughes. His body was dragged through the streets behind a car and hung from a tree for all to see. The mob then burned most of the town's black-owned businesses and homes to the ground. The governor imposed martial law. For 2 weeks, the state militia occupied Sherman. For the next 65 years, not a single black doctor or lawyer practiced within the city limits. Now, 75 years later, Andre Thomas, a black man who had been in an interracial relationship, faced trial in that same courthouse. During jury selection, prosecutors used a Texas option called the shuffle, a procedure where, based solely on what potential jurors look like as they sit in the courtroom, either side can request they be reseated in a different order. Initially, 6 African Americans were seated in the first 2 rows of potential jurors, meaning they'd be questioned first and were likely to end up on the jury. After the prosecution's shuffle request, there were 0 African Americans in the first 5 rows. The final result was an entirely white jury. A white judge, white prosecutors, white defense attorneys. But it gets worse. On questionnaires filled out by potential jurors, 3 of the selected jurors and 1 alternate indicated they were opposed to interracial couples marrying or having children. One wrote, "I don't believe God intended for this. We should stay with our bloodline." Another wrote, "I think it is harmful for the children involved because they do not have a specific race to belong to." A third wrote, "I think we should stay with our bloodline." Andre's court-appointed defense lawyers did not object to these statements. They didn't even question 2 of these jurors about their stated bias. The one they did question stood firm in his opposition to interracial relationships, and they still didn't use their peremptory strikes to remove him from the jury. During the trial itself, prosecutors repeatedly brought up irrelevant testimony about Andre's intimate relationships with other white women. In the final sentence of his closing argument in favor of the death penalty, the prosecutor looked at these jurors, including the ones who'd expressed opposition to interracial relationships, and asked, "Are you willing to risk letting Thomas ask out your daughter or granddaughter?" Let that sink in. The prosecutor's final appeal for the death penalty was rooted in racist fears about a black man dating white women. Years later, 3 Supreme Court justices, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, would write in a dissenting opinion that Andre's conviction and death sentence clearly violate the constitutional right to the effective assistance of counsel. But in 2005, the jury rejected Andre's insanity plea and found him guilty of capital murder. 4 days later, after just 1 hour of deliberation, they sentenced him to death. Less than a year after killing his family, 21-year-old Andre Thomas was sent to death row. After receiving his death sentence, Andre was sent to the Polunsky unit near Livingston, Texas, a prison that houses male death row inmates in extreme isolation. He continued to suffer severe delusions and hallucinations. He wore mittens to protect his remaining eye. His meals were served in brown paper bags because he couldn't be trusted with utensils, and staff feared he might harm himself. He reported hearing voices telling him to bash his head against the walls. Sometimes he saw 6-inch demons emerging from the prison walls, playing music by the band Queen. Other days, he said he felt fine and spent his time writing music for his mother. The voices never stopped. The medication helped sometimes, but the psychosis was relentless. On July 14, 2008, Andre managed to procure something sharp. Prison officials never determined exactly what and slashed a 7-centimeter gash across his throat, requiring 8 stitches. "I'm the cause of all the problems in the world," he told prison psychiatrists. "If I end my life, all the problems will stop." The next day, he reported confusion. "I was reading my Bible and got confused because I wasn't sure if it was the voices or my own thoughts telling me to do it." During a psychiatric assessment 1 week later, he explained that the government is conspiring to read my mind. "That's why I ripped out my right eye. That's the righteous side. They can't hear my thoughts anymore. I cut my throat. Got to shed a little blood to save the world." By late fall 2008, Andre was deteriorating rapidly. He stopped talking entirely, refused to eat, and came out to see his lawyer with scotch tape clumsily covering his mouth. He insisted on writing his answers to her questions on the glass partition with his finger. Then, in late November, something triggered another severe psychotic episode. He found himself in a cell next to an inmate who claimed to be the Antichrist. This enraged Andre. He believed he had already removed the Antichrist from the earthly realm by killing his son. This other inmate couldn't possibly be the Antichrist. The delusion consumed him. On December 9, 2008, nearly 4 years after removing his first eye, Andre gouged out his left eye with his bare hands. And then he ate it. When asked why days later, Andre explained with the same psychotic logic that had driven all his actions. He didn't want the government reading his thoughts through his eye. So he ate it because he was certain they would figure out some way to put it back in if he didn't destroy it completely. He also said he'd been reading the book of Revelation and felt sympathy for the devil. It wasn't all Satan's fault, he reasoned, since Andre himself remembered that he identified as someone connected to biblical prophecy who was supposed to have been aborted in the first place. Andre Thomas is now completely and permanently blind. After the second eye removal, prison officials recognized that the Polunsky unit was no longer appropriate for him. He was transferred to Jester 4, the state prison psychiatric unit in Richmond, Texas. He's held there today, locked in a small cell 23 hours a day, his eyelids surgically closed over empty eye sockets, receiving multiple powerful antipsychotic medications daily. He never learned Braille. The medications knock him out for large portions of each day. He still hallucinates, still hears voices, still exists in a reality the rest of us can't even imagine. In early 2020, Andre's case reached the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. His attorney, Catherine Carroll, argued that his original trial representation was ineffective. His trial lawyers had failed to object to the racially biased jurors, present an accurate account of his long-standing psychiatric problems, request a competency hearing despite obvious red flags, present expert witnesses qualified to address substance-induced psychosis. The appeal failed. The trial verdict was upheld. In October 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review his case. In a dissenting opinion, Justice Sotomayor, joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, wrote that this case involves a heinous crime apparently committed by someone who suffered severe psychological trauma and that allowing the conviction to stand violated his constitutional rights. But the majority declined to intervene. On November 7, 2022, the Grayson County District Court set an execution date for April 5, 2023. Andre's attorneys immediately filed a clemency petition with Texas Governor Greg Abbott and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. Attached to that petition were letters of support from more than 100 Texas faith leaders from Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and Buddhist traditions, 77 mental health professionals, numerous advocacy organizations, Reverend Dr. Jamie Callesser, senior pastor of Dallas City Temple, spoke at a press conference. "We are united in our conviction that it would be a senseless act of vengeance. The answer to violence is never more violence." Greg Hanch, executive director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Texas, noted it's hard, if not impossible, to overcome severe mental illness without help from mental health services, the kind of help that Mr. Thomas sought and did not receive. On March 7, 2023, just weeks before the scheduled execution, Judge Jim Fallon of the 15th Judicial District Court withdrew the execution date. He gave Andre's legal team until July 5th to file evidence proving his incompetence for execution. The execution was postponed, but not canceled. While Andre's individual case worked its way through the courts, a broader battle was taking shape in the Texas legislature. Since 2017, State Representative Tony Rose, a Democrat from Dallas, has repeatedly filed legislation that would prohibit the death penalty for defendants with severe mental illness. House Bill 727 would set up a pre-trial process where capital murder defendants could present evidence of severe mental illness. If a jury determines the defendant has schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder that substantially impairs their judgment, they would be ineligible for the death penalty and automatically sentenced to life without parole instead. The bill has passed the Texas House 3 times in 2021, 2023, and again in subsequent sessions, each time with growing bipartisan support. In 2021, it passed 108 to 35. In 2023, it passed 97 to 48. Republican Representative Jeff Leach from Plano, a strong supporter of the death penalty, co-authored the bill. "I am against executing people who, at the time they commit the offense, had a severe mental illness," he said during the floor debate. But each time, the bill has died in the more conservative Texas Senate, which has refused to even hold hearings on it. The bill is not retroactive. It would not help Andre, Thomas, or others already on death row. But it represents a growing recognition that something is fundamentally wrong with executing the severely mentally ill. The irony is painful. Texas nearly passed legislation that would have prevented cases exactly like Andre's, but that legislation came too late to save him. Meanwhile, the Grayson County District Attorney's Office has remained firm. Prosecutor J. Carrie Ashmore told reporters none of these people know anything about the case. They are parroting what the defense has told them. A jury has spoken about what justice should be in this case. We are not going to ignore that. He's reviewed records that he says indicate Andre knows why he's in prison and was aware of his execution date. In other words, the prosecution argues he's competent enough to be executed. As of January 2026, Andre Lee Thomas remains alive at the Wayne Scott Unit Psychiatric Facility in Texas. He is 42 years old, blind, and continues experiencing hallucinations despite being heavily medicated with antipsychotic drugs. A competency hearing is scheduled for March 9, 2026, before Judge Jim Fallon. This hearing is expected to be Andre's final chance to avoid execution. The central question is Andre Thomas competent to be executed? The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the Eighth Amendment prohibits executing someone who lacks a rational understanding of why they're being put to death. But defining rational understanding when someone is as severely mentally ill as Andre is extraordinarily complex. Andre's lead attorney, Maury Levin, has called him one of the most mentally ill prisoners in Texas history. She argues, guiding this blind, delusional man onto Texas's gurney would be an indelible image that would cast a permanent shadow over Texas's reputation. Texas can keep the public safe by keeping Mr. Thomas in prison for life. The United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights highlighted Andre's case in 2015, saying he and others like him are tormented souls suffering from devastating afflictions that leave them unable to think and reason like people who are not so afflicted. That is a greater punishment than any court can impose. If the March 2026 competency hearing determines Andre is competent, Texas will likely set a new execution date. If he's found incompetent, he will remain in psychiatric prison indefinitely. There's one more complication. If Andre's sentence were commuted to life in prison, he would fall under the laws that existed in 2004 when life without parole wasn't yet an option in Texas. That means he could theoretically be eligible for parole after 20 years. This fact has made some victim advocates and prosecutors even more determined to see the death sentence carried out. 3 innocent people lost their lives on March 27, 2004. Laura Boren was 20 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. Andre Lee Boren Jr. was 4 years old. He loved stuffed animals and playing at the park across from his apartment. Leyha Marie Hughes was 13 months old, barely old enough to walk. Their deaths were unspeakably tragic, horrific, and here's the hardest truth of all: preventable. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What responsibility does society have when we see someone spiraling into severe mental illness? When Andre walked out of that hospital emergency room, dangerously psychotic, with an active warrant, why didn't anyone go looking for him? When he showed up at a mental health facility begging for help, saying life is too much to handle, why was he allowed to simply leave? When a 9-year-old child starts hearing voices, when a 10-year-old attempts suicide, when warning signs are everywhere, why does nothing change? And perhaps the most difficult question, does executing someone this severely mentally ill serve any purpose? Is it justice? Is it vengeance? Is it something else entirely? The prosecution argues that a jury has spoken, that justice demands the death penalty be carried out, that Andre knew right from wrong at some level and should be held fully accountable. The defense argues that executing a blind man who gouged out his own eyes and ate one of them, who still hallucinates constantly despite heavy medication, who has never had a lucid moment to truly comprehend what he did, executing him will be cruel and unusual punishment. Mental health advocates argue this case represents a systemic failure. The system failed Andre as a child. The system failed him as a teenager. The system failed him as a young adult. And now they say the system is preparing to fail him one final time. Faith leaders across Texas have argued that mercy, not vengeance, should guide us. That a just and loving God would not want us to execute someone this profoundly ill. Legal scholars point to the racial bias that infected his trial, the ineffective assistance of counsel, and the questions about his competency that were never properly addressed. And victim advocates remind us that 3 innocent people, a young mother and 2 small children, suffered horrific deaths and deserve justice. All of these perspectives contain truth. This is not a simple story with easy answers. What is clear is this: Andre Lee Thomas is a product of generational trauma, untreated mental illness, crushing poverty, and a system that failed him at every critical juncture. That doesn't excuse what he did. Nothing can. Those 3 lives are gone forever, and no amount of explanation or context changes that terrible fact. But it does force us to ask, when we see the warning signs next time, and there will be a next time, will we do anything different? Will we fund mental health services for low-income families? Will we train police to follow up on warrants for mentally ill individuals in crisis? Will we ensure hospitals don't let dangerously psychotic patients simply walk out the door? Will we pass legislation like House Bill 727 that recognizes severe mental illness as a factor in capital cases? Or will we continue down the same path, creating more tragedies, more victims, more Andre Thomases? On March 9, 2026, a judge will determine Andre Thomas's competency. Whatever that determination is, this case will remain a stark reminder of what happens when every system designed to catch someone before they fall simply looks away. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, please reach out for help. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7 by calling or texting 988. You are not alone. Once again, this has been the Crime Case Reports. If this story moved you, if you want help keep memories alive and support the search for justice, please like this video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that deserve to be told.